Hi, welcome back to Beck's Corner Garden. I'm Brandon, and today is winter solstice of 2020. That means that we are well into the planning of the 2021 garden season, and as we were discussing it with ourselves, we kind of wanted to make a journal entry of what we did and didn't do this year that we're going to do next year. Um, when we started our seeds for our 2020 garden at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, uh, we started everything that we were planting all at once, even though we had it in our heads that we were going to do the the staggered planting or the what's it called, succession planting. We had it in our heads that we were going to do the succession planting, but we started a ton of seeds all at once. So when it came down to it, the first time we went out to plant seeds, we filled most of our garden space. We did leave some space with the idea that we were going to go back in and fill it in, but by that point, the seedlings that we had gotten had outgrown their pots, had all been sickly and dying, and um, we did start a few like tomato suckers and stuff like that. Like we had a whole bed that was nothing but tomatoes that we had started from suckers, which was really cool. But we kind of let those go and we didn't trellis them right, and they just ended up going over and making a big mass of tomatoes with their neighboring tomato plants. So it was fun. We got a lot of tomatoes out of it still, but it wasn't pretty and it wasn't as good as it could have been. Um, and we didn't get that staggered out harvest that we were really hoping for. Hey, Bubba. Shane had to come say hi. Um, Also, last year we did learn that if you get the gnat problem in your seedlings, we ended up using a little bit of sand on it, and we just did a thin layer on the top of our seed starting mixture around the seedlings, and it really did help cut down on the gnats a lot. We also set out the this apple cider vinegar traps, and that caught a lot of them too. For our seeds, they're much more temperamental than a full grown plant, so we definitely need to make sure that we don't let them dry out and we don't overwater when we do water. There was a couple times that we did overwater them and we got some damping off problems with some of our tomatoes and peppers. And there are a couple times that we were scared to water them too much, so we let them dry out, which it caused problems of its own. So that nice even moisture we need to make sure we keep up on with our seedlings. Um, we did start all of our seedlings in solo cups. If you watched any of our beginning videos, you'll see them like lined up outside of our beds. We did eventually move them into the beds because we kept kicking them, but then we couldn't see the names on the cups. So the solo size is great for starting the seeds because we started the seeds in there, they grew in there, they were big plants in there. We took them outside, we didn't have to do a lot of up potting, so it was a big plus. But we definitely need to come up with a better labeling system for our garden because once everything starts growing, it's it's hard to keep track of it all. And then storms roll through. We live in Kansas, so there's high winds. The things that we did have the little plant tags on that we didn't secure well enough ended up everywhere. When we were planting, we accidentally mixed up some of the labels, so we had problems from the start. So definitely labeling will be better taken care of and dealt with in the 2021 season. Um, since we did start all of our seeds inside, we had to move them in and out right before we planted them out to harden them off. And we had several different containers that we had our solo cups and seed starters in. And we had some plastic tubs that had deep sides, probably a little bit about as tall as the solo cups, maybe a little shorter or taller. But they worked well because if they did bend or anything, the cups didn't necessarily flop out over the side and fall all over the place. They were a little more expensive and they were plastic. We used some of the aluminum metal roaster pans that were really cheap for the 3 packs, and those worked well, but they were flimsy. You had to make sure to grab the whole thing under the bottom to carry it, otherwise everything was going to fall everywhere. They were short enough to where the cups would fall over the sides, so that ended up being a little bit of an issue, moving that number of plants in and out at the hardening off time. We did use a couple of metal cake pans and a metal roaster pan or two that had handles on the side. Those were my favorite. They were sturdy, so even though the sides were a little bit shorter, we didn't have to worry so much about our seedlings rolling off the sides because they had a sturdier, firmer hold. We didn't have too many of those, and if we did want to go out and buy them, that would be pretty costly. So the pros and cons of all of those, but for the most part, everything that we used worked. We made it work because it's what we had. But I did like the sturdy metal pans and the plastic tubs the most. When we went to plant out, like I had said earlier, we had this idea of succession planting that we halfway did with squash and stuff and the suckers of the tomatoes, but not nearly on the level that we wanted to get a heavier harvest at the end of the season. But we will definitely make sure succession planting is on a better routine and schedule that we stick to in 2021. And part of what we're doing is, like, we started some of our tomatoes and peppers and eggplants a week or two ago, and they're little baby sproutlings inside, yay! And then here, more towards the middle end of January, we'll start another 20 or so, and then more towards February, we'll start another 20 or so that way we have a wide range of plants, and we will be able to plant out at different times. People are driving by waving, sorry. And it's sundown in December. It's starting to get a little cold. So we will definitely stick to that succession schedule more rigidly in 2021. Also, we are going to trellis and stake our plants immediately when we plant them. This is my goal. I swear it's going to happen. Our peppers and our eggplants, and we had quite a few plants that just really, really needed some support. We way underestimated how tall they were going to grow. We underestimated how much fruit they were going to put off. We underestimated everything that those plants did. And by the end of it, we just had peppers and eggplants laying on the ground because the plants were overweighted. Oh no, too much fruit. I know, it's such a horrible problem. It did make it easier access for bugs. We had a bunny friend in the garden that didn't ever really do too much damage, but if he'd wanted to, it would have been easy access for him. Our tomatoes, we had used the Florida weave system, and we had used the 8-foot, I think, T-post on the corners of the beds, and we just took baling string, this actually, and we weaved our plants through it. But by the time our bigger tomatoes were actually in full production, they were so heavy that our vines just sagged, and we ended up breaking some stems because of that. We accidentally topped a couple of tomatoes because of that. And so in 2021, we have a much better trellising system that we're going to put in place for our bigger plants especially. And we also know that things that we trellised this year, like cucumbers and stuff, need to be pruned down or planted further apart in order to get the best results for those, because we kind of overcrowded them and didn't really know how to prune the cucumbers and stuff properly. But we think we have a better idea of how to do it for next year, and it'll be better next year. Another thing about the trellising and staking is that without those in place, it was really hard to get to the plants to take care of them or to even get the fruit and find the fruit on them. So we're also going to be better, especially in the beginning, about keeping our eggplants and peppers and cucumbers pruned. Just because we missed a lot this year too. The plants got so big and bushy, and I guess I should have thought about it because they're all in the same family as tomatoes, but besides topping the pepper plants like I talked about in a past video to get them to bush out more, we didn't do any pruning of pepper plants. We didn't think that it was going to get so full and big that it was going to be an issue. Same thing with the eggplants. We just kind of let them grow because we didn't know, especially the eggplants, neither of us had ever grown at all before. I at least grew peppers and tomatoes and stuff younger with my grandma, and I think Austin had done some before we started our little garden. And we just had no idea. But now we know, and so we'll be able to take care of them better next year. So we'll still have our walkways, and we'll be able to get to and find all of our produce, which is kind of why we're growing it, because we want to get to it, eat it. We did do really well pruning the tomatoes because we knew about the one main vine. We actually started doing that with our vegetable patch in the 2019 garden when we first started vegetables in this whole little journey. So it was late in the season when we learned to prune the tomatoes. So last year was like our first full season that we kept up on our tomatoes. I think we did pretty well with them. And we've heard a lot of gardeners say that, they keep to a very rigid schedule with stuff like that until about July, and then it gets to the point where you just can't keep up on it and you just let them grow. That's pretty much what ended up happening with us. After July, the maintenance kind of slipped. It was just really hot and uncomfortable and a lot to keep up on. So, but it still did really well for us. And then hearing the other gardeners say that kind of validated, our own response to how things were growing in our garden, I guess. Some of the space that we did keep around the borders that we had intended to plant shorter day or quicker growing crops, like we intended to fill the beans out all the way around the yard, and there was a couple smaller spaces that just didn't get much use this summer, even though we had really high hopes for them. So another thing that we're going to be doing over the next couple seasons is when we have a plan for what's going to go into a bed, we're going to stick to that plan. We're not going to talk ourselves out of it or welch on it and end up having nothing in that space. I'm going to make sure there's something in that space. We'll give it its time of rest. We'll feed it properly, but we're going to plan out for these spaces and have them going at all times, or at least in process. And I think that will help with our produce production and our journey of selling and being more self-sufficient for ourselves. We did a pretty good job of keeping up on the watering. We didn't do that great of a job on watching the weather. There's a couple times that it had been dry for several days, so we were like, you know what? Everything's starting to look sad. We're going to go ahead and give it a good watering. And then the next morning we wake up and it's pouring. Granted, we live in Kansas. It's not always our fault. The weather doesn't always tell us when it's going to rain. But we also just kind of winged it a lot and went off our gut, which ended up being not right all the time. And we got some busted tomatoes and some blossom and rot and stuff like that I think could have been preventable. We're also going to need to stay up on the weed pressure and make sure that all of our beds get mulched last year. We were kind of slow on getting everything gathered. We had gotten a lot of our mulch after we already had plants in the ground. So we ended up mulching around some plants, which was okay, but some of our green bush bean bed, it was planted so thickly that we couldn't really mulch around the plants very easily, and we ended up having a lot of weed pressure. So we'll make sure to take care of that better next year as well. I think as far as harvesting goes, like I said, our plants were really big, and really, really productive, way more productive than I thought they would be. So some of our stuff did end up getting missed. Like, that made me sad. Um, and then some of the stuff, we just had so much of it at once that some of it we couldn't even give away. So it ended up going unused, like okra. When our 5 or 6 okra plants were in full swing, it was just like, what do we do with all this okra? So some of it went south, and we didn't quite have enough to pickle it, and it was these weird in-between times. But I think we have a better grip on how to better put away our foods at different phases, like dehydrating smaller amounts of okra, pickling larger amounts, and then of course eating whatever we want with our roasted veggies and stuff fresh. You can also bread it and freeze it and have it ready. So I think we've also learned about the freezing of tomatoes so that we can keep them stored before we actually put them away, and different things like that that I think will help prolong our harvest until we actually do have the time to stand in the kitchen for 6 hours and deal with all of it. We really need to not be as scared to like pick greener tomatoes or younger tomatoes if we think a storm is coming, or if we need to water the garden or something, and letting some of it just ripen inside. Our tenacity at wanting that nice ripe fruit right off the vine, especially me. I kind of left some of the stuff too long, and then it ended up storming or something, and we lost the fruit that we could have ripened inside on the counter just fine and still had fruit. So, it's the learning curve, I guess. It was year one. We also need to learn melons better because our smaller melons we got right, but our bigger, like Moon Stars watermelons and stuff, I think we only had 1 or 2 of those that was actually edible out of the 8 or 9 that we harvested, because most of them were underripe, and then 1 or 2 of them was just way overripe. We know it's difficult, but it's something that we want to learn more so we don't waste as much and we can actually get something out of what we grow in our efforts for the year. We also need to be better at bagging for seed saving. A lot of our intent was to save a bunch of seeds, which we didn't really need to because we just had fresh seed packets, so we still have seeds. But over the years, we want to be able to provide most of our own yearly seed stock. So we have to get better at going out and, like our heirloom tomatoes, as soon as we see that flower before it opens, getting a bag over it so we can have a pure tomato to save the seeds from. We did get a few done properly this year, but not nearly as many as we wanted. So in years to come, we will be much more diligent about saving seeds. Overall, I think the biggest thing that we learned and will be able to incorporate into the planning of our future gardens is how big stuff grew, how fast stuff grew, and what really does need the support of a trellis or staking system versus what doesn't need as much. And I think that will help us going into the future, being able to plan how and where we put everything. Besides our goals of expanding back here to get more compost and some of these trees out by next summer so we can kind of start doing something back here too, I think we did pretty good for the first year, and we're just going to keep expanding and keep growing, and hopefully some of our mistakes will translate into lessons for you that won't be mistakes that you have to make. So learn from us, learn from our failures, and I'll talk to you again soon. Have a good one, guys.